Well, it's 7:05, so we might as well get started as people continue to join us. But welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this Q&A on prescribed fire, wildland fire, and fire ecology in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. My name is Neil Gifford. I'm the Conservation Director for the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, and I have enjoyed 25 years of working full-time in this place for this organization. And I started off after grad school volunteering and working various seasonal jobs, from prescribed burner to seasonal butterfly, science tech, all kinds of things. So it's nice to see everyone joining us tonight to talk about fire. With us, we have actually my whole staff, so the three people that I get the joy of supervising every day, and I will let them introduce themselves. And this is really a question and answer session. It is not a presentation. We haven't prepared any slides or anything to really present to you. It's an opportunity for you to ask us any and all questions you have about the preserve, and specifically about our use of wildland fire to try and restore ecosystem health to the world's best remaining example of a globally rare pitch pine scrub oak barren. Dylan, do you want to start off?
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Dylan. I'm the field ecologist and entomologist with the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. I've been here for a little over 10 years. My job titles changed a little bit over that time too. I started as a seasonal assistant ecologist, then became the field ecologist and environmental educator. And now I am the field ecologist and entomologist. And I certify every year as a wildland firefighter type 2. So that I can help out on the prescribed burns at the Pine Bush, and so that I'll be able to assist in any wildfires if we need to help with some wildfire management in New York State.
Tyler, you want to go next? Thanks, Dylan.
Sure. My name is Tyler Briggs. I'm the fire manager here at the Albany Pine Bush. I've been with the commission since 2011, and in this role since 2012. My role here is I plan and organize the controlled burns on the preserve, and my experience is mainly in prescribed fire, although I do have some wildland firefighting experience as well. I'm a NWCG, National Wildfire Coordination Group, burn boss type 2, incident commander type 4, crew boss, firing boss, engine boss, and yeah, I'll be happy to answer anybody's questions about any of that stuff.
Thanks, Tyler. Steve, Dr. Campbell.
Steve Campbell, I'm the conservation biologist. I've been here coming up on, I think, 10 years next month. I'm primarily responsible for designing our research studies, managing our data, analyzing our data, basically for all things wildlife, plants, fire, all of that. It sort of falls, comes through me. Everybody's involved, but that's sort of my contribution.
Thanks, Steve. All right, so Dylan, do you have access to the list of questions we received ahead of time?
Yes, I do. So the first one is from Gina, and they ask, I'd like to know what happens to all of the wildlife when you've been doing as many burns as have been done over the past several years. Yeah, I think Gina is wondering what happens to the wildlife during burns.
Okay, great. That's a great question, Gina. So we have been utilizing prescribed fire in the pine bush since 1991, and in that time, we've burned a little over 3,000 acres of the preserve. The footprint is a little bit smaller than that. Some of those areas have been burned multiple times over the course of those 31 years. And we are always concerned about wildlife, and for the most part, we manage wildlife and to minimize wildlife injuries and fatalities and harm to wildlife during burns by spacing the burns out both through time and spatially. So we try never to burn too much at any one time. Our management units are pretty small. They range from anywhere from about 2 acres up to 50 acres, and the whole preserve is 3,400 acres. So within each section of the preserve, we generally don't treat more than a third. But usually if it's in this time of year in the dormant season, before things really get going, wildlife aren't really breeding yet. So most things are either still asleep in the ground or on the ground and close to their burrows. So either, if they can move, they will move, but certainly some of that wildlife could be harmed by individual prescribed fires. When we do growing season burns, that's probably a little more true. And again, we're careful not to burn too much too quickly. Anything that can move does, and in particular, not only flying insects and birds, but a lot of the animals underground burrows and escape into their underground burrows during the fires. But it's a catch-22. I won't lie to anyone and say that no wildlife is harmed in these during our fires, because of course, even these insects, there's all kinds of insects in these management. And it's a catch-22. And I think the best example of our approach is the Karner Blue. It's interesting that no life stage of the Karner Blue butterfly can survive fire. Not eggs, caterpillars, the pupae or chrysalis, some people call them, or the adult butterflies. An adult butterfly doesn't typically, they're very weak flyers. They don't usually go more than a couple hundred meters from the patch of lupin they hatch in, and they don't live more than 3 to 5 days on average in the wild. Yet they only live in places that burn very frequently. So ultimately, it's a matter of managing habitat to maintain and actually improve populations, even if that may harm a few individuals. And in the case of the Karner, when we started managing the preserve in 1991 with fire, we had, less than 13 acres of habitat and only a few hundred butterflies at best. And now we're managing on the order of 200 to 300 acres a year with fire. And thanks to all of our restoration efforts, from mowing and burning and planting lupin and all the rest, we now have about 700 acres of lupin in the preserve. And the Karner population is in the tens of thousands. Last year, just the small portion of the preserve that we actually survey, it was what, Steve, around 16,000 butterflies in the second brood last year in July.
I think it's close to that.
So ultimately, long story short, and I'm too late. The fires may actually harm some individuals, but the populations, especially the populations of the rare wildlife that really depend on the kind of habitat that you see behind us, depend on relatively frequent recurring wildland fire in order for their populations to persist in the long term. It's a little counterintuitive that animals that can't survive fire depend on fire to create and maintain their habitat, but that is indeed the beauty of the fire ecology of pine boulders.
Cool.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, guys.
Right. Tyler, you're up.
I was just going to say, just to echo a little bit what Neil was saying at the beginning, if you just go to like Google Maps and zoom in on the Albany Pine Bush and then turn on satellite view, you can see the burn scars of some of the burns that we've done, and they'll show up as brown kind of polygons on the green landscape. And it's not the entire preserve at once. It's little pieces in different regions of the preserve. So we're not burning like the entire preserve. So a lot of the animals, to echo what Neil was saying, have time to move around. And when we ignite the actual fires, we're not igniting the entire block all at once. We're walking across it and burning it kind of slowly.
Yep, great point,
Yeah.
Tyler. Steve,
I would add to that we we don't want to be managed for the individuals. If we were to try to protect every individual, we wouldn't be burning at all. And in that case, we're going to end up losing the populations over the long term. And so we sort of sacrifice individuals in the short term for the long-term persistence of these populations. That's sort of what Neil said, but that's sort of a little bit more of like we're managing for populations, and we lose some individuals certainly in doing that. But if we didn't manage for the populations, if we didn't burn at all, we'd lose all the individuals, and we'd lose whole populations of species.
Billy, can you pan that down a little bit? Wait, no, that was great. I was going to point to that map that you had up, and then it disappeared. Thank you, Steve and Tyler. That was great. Dylan, I can barely see the burn scar, and Truax barrens. Can you pan to that? There we go. That's good enough. I think you'll be able to see that. But you can see how both in Karner Barrens East, just north of the Discovery Center, right there is a small growing season burn, and a slightly larger burn in the Truax Barrens off of Kings Road. And that's a couple of patches out of a 3,400 acre preserve. But since Dylan has this map up, I will say we are conscientious and we don't manage the whole. We don't only manage thinking about the whole preserve. You can see how the preserve is chopped up into blocks or sections by the various roads, the thruway, Route 155 are the two most obvious. So within any given one of those sections, we are also thinking about not doing too much too quickly in any one year to make sure that there's plenty of what's called refugia for wildlife, places for wildlife to escape to. The vegetation responds usually within a matter of weeks. Then the wildlife will frequently move back into those spots where they came from. Thanks for the map, Dylan.
Yeah, apologies for all of my flags. Apparently my pins I've dropped and labeled on things. So Steve, I was going to ask you, so Trevor had asked us specifically about the Karner Blue and about burning that. And so I thought maybe you could speak to a little bit of how we know that we're not burning the Karner into extinction. That was his concern.
All right, I will share a screen. So here's our population over, what's that coming up? Hold on.
It's there, but it's your presenter view. You want to go to the slideshow with the current slide?
Yeah, it does it by default. How about now?
Yeah, perfect.
That's good.
So you can see overall we've been doing well. The Karner has been responding to our management. So back in 2007, we're talking the population was here in a few, just in the hundreds. And these bars here show you the area that we're surveying, and what this really represents is the amount of area that we've been restoring. So oftentimes, if due to fire suppression, we'd have black locusts and other trees move in, and forests would move in and take over the barrens. So we'd be restoring those areas, we'd be clearing out those forests, we'd be reintroducing fire back into those areas, we'd be reintroducing butterflies back into those areas. So that increase in the area that we're surveying reflects the increase in our restoration efforts. So we're bringing more habitat into the preserve for the Karner Blue. And then you can see then how our population has been responding from a low of a couple hundred in 2007 up to, we sort of peaked at around 2015, then it sort of fluctuated, and then we had a absolutely ridiculous year in 2020 where the population just exploded, as sometimes insect populations do. But you can see overall, I mean, that's sort of what we expect is these fluctuations from year to year with these insect populations. But the big thing here, I would say, is that by bringing all this habitat, restoring all this habitat, you can see we've now put this Karner sort of safely into the tens of thousands as opposed to down in the hundreds. And that dashed line that you see there across the bottom is the federal recovery threshold. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is calling for us having at least 3,000 butterflies in the preserve in order for our particular population in the preserve to be considered stable and can be counted towards delisting. You can't delist the whole species until it's recovered its crossed its range, but by us being above 3,000, we're saying that our particular population by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service standards is considered recovered. And so you can see starting in 2013, our first brood crossed that threshold for the first time. And although we're fluctuating, we've maintained above that regularly. So it gets back to Neil's earlier point. We are certainly killing butterflies while we burn, but overall, as we manage for the population and as we're managing for the habitat, we're having more and more habitat available, which is then increasing the overall population of the butterfly.
And you can see how the green bars kind of plateaued around 50 hectares. That's kind of the maximum that we can survey. There's how many hectares? What's 700 acres into hectares? That's like 150 hectares in the preserve of occupied Karner habitat. So our estimates here are pretty conservative because they only relate to the area we physically survey. There's more than twice as much habitat in the preserve that is occupied by Karner blue butterflies, where we've gone out and searched and found them, and we know that they're in all those patches of lupin that are shaded green here across the preserve. So we know we have a lot more habitat out there. The blue areas are the areas we physically survey. So those numbers that Steve just showed you in that graph of, bouncing around 10 to 15,000 a year relates only to the blue polygons, the dark blue shaded areas that you see on. We're not extrapolating that estimated population size, the whole of the preserve, or even all of the lupin that's in the pool. The reality is we don't survey that. We don't know exactly what's there. All we know for sure is that we have, 10 to 15,000 on average each year for the last 5 or 6 in the areas we survey.
If I can
Again,
say,
is more than three times higher than the federal recovery threshold.
and if I could add one more point to the earlier point about how, so we only burn parts of the preserve. We try not to burn too much, but the population is distributed across all these different subpopulations. So these different outlines you see here are different parts of the preserve. That usually there's going to be roads or something that divides these things. So here's 155 divides up populations. So they're right across the street from each other, but we consider them subpopulations. But we've divided the whole preserve up into subpopulations. And so the key is here, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. We don't want to have all our populations, our whole Karner population in one part of the preserve, because if you burn that part of the preserve or too much of that preserve, you can have detrimental impacts. So if you look here, this shows you the contributions for each of those different subpopulations back here. So each of those different colors reflects the different subpopulations. And here you can see the contributions of each of the subpopulations to the overall population. And this is for just the second brood subpopulation estimates. And there's a lot of pie up here, but the big thing is we're getting a lot more, we're being represented in a lot more subpopulations now than we were early on when we only had them in 2 or 3 parts of the preserve. Now we have them measurable populations in 7 and 8 subpopulations within the preserve. So we're increasing the distribution in addition to increasing the population size.
Awesome. All right, we had one more question that was submitted pre the program tonight. So we'll just get to that and then we'll start getting ready to getting to the, we've got some really good questions submitted tonight. So Tyler, if you could talk really quick, Billy expressed concern on Facebook about us burning during a county-wide bird ban until the end of the month. So do you want to address that?
Sure. So we're allowed to burn during the burn ban basically because we have an approved plan by the state. So when we burn, we're burning with a bunch of qualified and trained firefighters under set weather parameters that are deemed safe by the state of New York. So when we implement a burn, it's not, there's a minimum of 10 certified wildland firefighters that are there. So for example, this week's burn, we had 27 in attendance. So we're way above the threshold. And then it's also staffed with fire engines, and we've done prep work around the unit. So I'd be happy to go into specifics more about it, but basically the New York State burn ban was put in place to stop the amount, or to decrease the amount of wildfires that happen in the spring in the state of New York. And since they put that burn ban in place, it's done that. It's decreased the amount of wildfires that happen in the state. We're allowed to burn within that time frame, basically because we've created fire breaks around the unit, and we've staffed the burn with wildland firefighters.
Tyler, can you talk about the narrow environmental conditions? So in addition to having a permit, of course, effectively our burn plans that are approved by the state are your permit. And there are other exemptions to the burn ban as well, provided that you have a permit, you can burn. But specifically for what we do, can you talk about the environmental conditions and the narrow kind of Goldilocks zone with those conditions that we're really looking for? So it's not like we can burn on any given day, but that there's a very narrow suite of conditions we got to try and find.
Yeah, sure. So basically our burn season starts in the spring when we get consistent temperatures above freezing and after snowmelt. This is the beginning of the dormant season is what we call it. And that basically starts around St. Patrick's Day or whenever we thaw out every spring, and goes until about the first week of June when we're in full leaf out growing season. And during that time, sunlight it'll penetrate and dry out the dead organic vegetation on the forest floor. where that's not the case, during the growing season, when it takes longer to dry all the fuels out. So the spring dormant season, basically it starts in March and ends at the beginning of June. And that's when most of the wildfires in New York State typically happen. And that's when the fuels are dry and ready to burn. Was that what you were looking for, Neil?
Well, specifically, what are the weather conditions? What are the things you look for? There's wind direction, wind speed,
Oh.
RH.
Yeah, so within each of the regions of the preserve, we've broken the land out geographically into what we call management units, and those were mainly chosen based on smoke shed concerns. So, for example, if we're burning on the north side of the thruway, we're going to burn it with some sort of southern component to the wind to push the smoke away from that smoke sensitive area. So it's important to have wind coming from a consistent direction when you're burning nearby a smoke sensitive area, but you don't want the wind to overpower and push the column down, creating nuisance smoke downwind. So wind is one of the parameters. We need some wind, but we don't want an overwhelming amount of wind. Temperature is a factor. We don't burn below 33 because the water will freeze, and then we don't burn above 95 because of risk to wildland firefighter heat exhaustion. So those are some of the parameters that we consider when we burn.
Awesome. Thanks, Tyler. So hopefully that got to Andrea's question, or at least part of your question. Tyler, it sounds like you had a successful burn this week from your voice.
No, it was okay. Actually, our humidity got out of prescription during the burn this week, so we shut it down after burning for about an hour. Is that Scott's question in the Q&A?
Yeah.
So Scott, the burn was burning well, but then we got out of prescription, so we ended up stopping burning after about an hour.
And that happens if anybody has tried to plan a picnic or plan an outing, and how well you watch the weather to see if you can be outside or not. Imagine that magnified by 100-fold for what Tyler does. And watching the daily forecast, he requests and gets a specific daily forecast directly from the National Weather Service in Albany. And even despite having those experts and their expertise at his beck and call to a degree, weather can change, right? It's not an exact science. And when he was burning yesterday, despite a forecast that the low relative humidity would be 40%, it actually got much drier. And once that relative humidity fell out of what was acceptable, he shut the burn down, which sometimes happens.
I thought you were hoarse because you had burned it burned so well, and you just spent the whole day burning. So Timothy has an interesting question, and this might kind of tie into the second part of Andrea's question. And Timothy says, how closely does your prescribed fire program mimic the natural fire regime? Are the frequency, intensity, and size of your burns consistent with what would happen without human suppression efforts?
Well, okay, I'm going to take that. Can I start to take that part by part? So how closely the prescribed fires mimic the natural fire regime is to be determined. And one of the things about managing pine barrens is that there are fewer than 20 of them left, and none of them were considered really very high quality and fully functional when management started. So we are needing to basically figure this out as we go. And basically what we're learning is that, yeah, the types of fires we're putting on the ground are useful in the maintenance phase of things and helping maintain high quality habitat when it is more or less restored and looks like what's behind Dylan, Steve. But to get it there initially, we needed to use a number of additional tools because fire had been kept out for decades. And that's where the mowing and the tree cutting and some of those other things come into play. But we believe that we are actually now that we have close to about 1,000 acres that I would consider to be in the maintenance phase, or I hate to use the term restored because restoration is a process. It takes decades. It's not an event. So, but for all intents and purposes, let's say that what's behind Dylan and Steve is restored, and we have about close to 1,000 acres of that kind of condition. So now that we're putting fire in there, yeah, that's mimicking the natural fire regime, but we're still trying to figure out what that natural fire regime was. And to do that, we're using a couple of clues. One is the historical evidence. So we have, sediment cores out of wetlands. We also have a lot of really good wildlife data that gives us a strong indication of the kind of structure. Again, looking behind those photographs behind Steve and Dylan, the historical wildlife data says the habitat was much, much more open. All the rare wildlife that used to be here in large populations simultaneously needs a condition that looks like that. It's kind of a grassy shrubland or a shrubby grassland underneath this open canopy of pitch pine. That's the ideal. That's the rarest community. That's truly the globally rare inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens. As far as the frequency, intensity, and size, what we're doing now size-wise does not mimic what happened naturally, because historically, this site was at least 25,000 acres of pine barrens, if not closer to 50,000 acres of pine barrens. So the fires then would have burned on the order of, 1,000 or a couple thousand acres a year, at least. Those fires were also, we believe, largely indigenous set. So lightning, I'm sure lightning had an occasionally important role in this landscape, but we now know all across North America in these fire dependent systems, they were largely shaped and maintained by indigenous populations, literally for thousands of years before European colonization. So the type of fire that would maintain this system now, we believe, is kind of high frequency, once every 3 to 5 years on average, maybe as long as 10 years for any given spot that it would burn. But they're high frequency, but low intensity, low severity fires like the one that's behind me, where flame lengths aren't more than really 6 feet tall. And the rates of spread are manageable. And really it's a matter of burning off not decades of accumulated dead material, but really just a few years worth at a time. So you end up with these pretty manageable, relatively light, but high frequency fires. We know historically there were anywhere from 2 to 15 fires in this landscape a year. So we think we believe what we're doing is mimicking the natural fire regime. Our best clue about that, again, takes us back to the wildlife. If we're managing the site effectively and using fire appropriately, the distribution and abundance of those rare wildlife, there are 74, I believe, wildlife species of greatest conservation need, and many of those require fire-managed pine barrens. The distribution and abundance of those animals will go up if we're managing the site appropriately and putting the right kind of fire on the ground the right time of year. I like to say, and these guys get tired of hearing me say it, but we're not so much fire managers as we're fire effects managers. Fire is a means to an end, and it is a tool that produces results that are exclusive to fire, in particular with nutrient cycling. And what that nutrient cycling does for the plants, and then what the plants are able to do for the animals, the fire ecology of this place is mind-blowing. It's fascinating to me still after 25 years. So long story short, Timothy, I think we are now beginning to approach replicating that indigenous fire stewardship that was on this landscape for several thousand years that allowed the plants and animals that were here historically in big numbers to persist. And we are seeing indeed not only the Karner Blue, like we just showed you, but other species, their distribution and abundance is also going up in response to wildland.
I just like to say, because Neil used a couple words that maybe not everybody is familiar with, and that's soil cores. So you may have heard about how scientists do ice cores in glaciers and on the poles, and they look at the air bubbles in there to look at how our carbon in the atmosphere has changed. Well, soil cores are similar. They just dig down and pull up a big tube of soil. And they usually do this in wetlands because the soil there is more well preserved because it hasn't been eroded away. Similar, looking for little air bubbles, you can look for pollen grains and you can identify how the vegetation community has changed. And you can also actually see black layers of charcoal where big wildfires happened and that charcoal was deposited. And you can actually kind of time when those fires occurred. So that's what we mean by soil cores. And then fire scars are literally what they sound like. They are when a tree is damaged in a fire, but it's able to survive and it keeps growing. If you take a core from that tree, you can drill into it and pull out a sample, or if you were to cut that tree down, you can actually see a charcoal layer in the rings of the tree, or you can see a charcoal kind of damaged portion of the tree. That's called a fire scar, and we can also use that to try and figure out what the fire history of a place is.
And if anybody's familiar with the Pine Barrens Vernal Pond in Karner Barrens East, which is loaded with sphagnum and peat. So we cored that, and within a meter, the carbon dating showed that that core, that 1 meter of sediment to the bottom of that thing covered 6,600 years. And you could see the pollen has been dominated by oak and pine for a long time. And you can see very frequent and recurring wildland fire records in that sediment, almost like a layer cake or like rings in a tree. Thanks, Dylan.
Can I add something to the question?
Sure.
So big, let me share. Really, I just wanted to share this because I spent a lot of time making this, so.
It's a wonderfully looking quilt, Steve.
Well, no, here, let me first show this.
Also fire. Love this slide.
So what we're flipping through here, so an important part of the natural disturbance regime that we try to mimic is there's a spatial and temporal component to that. And so is this not animating?
It was, and
Wasn't
then
it
it stopped.
stopped?
Oh, there
Okay.
it goes.
So this flipping through quickly, but part of this natural disturbance regime is there in space and time, the burns are sort of jumping all around. And I wouldn't, Neil, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we actually really know how quickly things moved around on the landscape, how much it burned and how quickly things return. But this gives you an idea of what we're doing now and how we are sort of introducing this diversity across the landscape. We can call it shifting mosaic, because the result is it ends up with something like this, where you have different areas that are all in different stages of time since they've been burned. And in conservation biology, oftentimes we say diversity begets diversity. So here we have a diversity of time, years since the vegetation is recovered from burning. So you get different stages of vegetation regeneration from all the way from 1 year all the way out until, depending on if we get how quickly we get back, 10 or more years. That gives you different vegetation structure, which then give you different species that can occur in those parts of the preserve. And so there's a spatial and temporal component to this that we are mimicking in some capacity. We don't know how well we're mimicking what actually occurred here because we don't have a strong sense of the spatial and temporal. We have some idea about fire frequency and how quickly it returned to some areas, but in terms of the spatial footprint, we don't know. But we are bringing back some of this diversity that almost certainly went along with this natural disturbance regime.
Steve, I thought that was a really awesome graphic. And yeah, to go to Timothy's question, yeah, we have increased frequency, but that graphic shows it's not in the same actual space. The burns are spread out around the preserve, so we're not hitting the same specific spot over and over and over again. And then there are some old aerial photos. The oldest one I've seen is around the 1950s, which do capture burn scars in the Albany Pine Bush area. And the burn scars that are captured in that imagery is much larger than an area that we would burn today.
That's a great point, Tyler. And in particular, if you think historically, before we were suppressing fires, fire would roam across the landscape once one started until it either ran out of fuel or the weather put it out. And that's still the way fire works across the western states, up in Canada, up in Alaska. Fires burn for months. There are cases now where you've got fires that are smoldering in the permafrost, in the peat, under the snow all winter, only to pop up again in the spring when things warm up again. But historically, fires would roam across a landscape and ebb and flow for weeks and months on end.
And to what Neil was saying there, I've talked to people on Kings
Nice.
Road that speak of the time when they were growing up there, and it was their grandparents' house, and they remember fire flaring. And I'm getting an echo. We were just talking about how what Neil was saying. They'd have fires that would last a couple weeks that were burning out there in the pine bush.
So I see 4 distinct fire scars, fire records of recent fires with this illustration. There are 2, that's the most obvious one. That's probably that same, not long before this picture was taken. And there's one kind of elongated to the right. Yep, that little one. And then if you look south of both of those, starting up at that first one, Dylan, that whole area has a blackened, yes. So that was a very large fire that crossed that sand road and burned almost down to what is now Blueberry Hill. But you can see in the 1950s, this was one big contiguous piece of open space. And when a fire started, it could actually roam. Today, of course, I don't know if you have the next slide, Dylan, of like the 1990 image, but if you're familiar with the landscape today, right, this is what we have today. We've got, we have a postage stamp sized relic of what this ecosystem used to be, preserved. And then we've taken that postage stamp and cut it up into a bunch of disjunct pieces. So it's a lot harder today for not only fire, but for plants and animals to move across that fragmented landscape. But inevitably, another important point there is fire is as inevitable as sunshine and rain to making this system tick. Many of the adaptations chemically that the plants have for dealing with moisture, water stress, they live in a veritable desert. Make them very flammable. The oils and waxes and terpenes that are the chemical content of huckleberry and blueberry and New Jersey tea and pitch pine, even scrub oak, makes them very flammable. So the place wants to burn, and it will eventually burn. We've had a number of small wildfires, or whether they're accidental or arson, we don't know. But over the past 25 years since I've been here, but eventually this place will burn. So really, from a fire management perspective, it's also about managing risk and keeping fuel loads. It's a fire ecology term, but basically keeping the amount of burnable material low enough by burning frequently that if and when a wildfire does occur, which does happen, they're relatively straightforward and manageable to either control or extinguish. Whereas in the past, like what you see now out west, after decades and decades of fire suppression, when fires do occur, they become these mega fires because we've suppressed fire for so long that when a fire happens, there's decades of fuel and you have those major fires. So we burn for both of those reasons. One is, of course, to conserve the rare ecology, but also to reduce the risk of wildfires to protect not only the wildlife in the preserve, but also our preserve neighbors.
So Beth asked, can you speak to what the training for controlled burns consists of?
Sure. Yeah. So in order to get certified as a wildland firefighter, you need to take some coursework and then pass a physical fitness test. So if you were going to take the class in person, they offer it in Long Island every year at the New York Wildfire and Incident Management Academy. They charge per day there, but basically it's a 35 or 37-hour course where they put you through it in person. At the Pine Bush, we also offer an option to take that class online in a self-paced course where you just have to attend for the field day. So the training itself is some introduction classes into the incident command system. So there's 2 FEMA classes that are basically teaching you about incident command. And the incident command system is a system in the United States to manage wildfires, hurricanes, or any kind of natural disaster. So it basically outlines the roles and responsibilities of the people involved. And those classes are pretty dry. But you can take them online if you're interested. They're free. And then you just print out your certificate for the 2 FEMA courses. And then there are 3 National Wildfire Coordination Group classes you have to take. And National Wildfire Coordination Group, or NWCG, is the group that comes out with national standards for wildland firefighting in the US. Those classes are a little more interesting. They deal with how weather and topography, fuels influence fire behavior and human factors on the fire line. But you work yourself through those classes, you print off your certificates to those, and then you have to take a work capacity test is what it's called. And to burn with us here at the Pine Bush, you have to pass the moderate pack test, which is a 2-mile hike. And you have to do that in 30 minutes carrying a 25-pound backpack. And if you want to fight fires out of state, you have to do the arduous pack test, which is a 3-mile hike with a 45-pound backpack. And you have 45 minutes to do the work capacity test. So there's a little bit of coursework, and then there's that physical fitness test. And that's how you get certified as a wildland firefighter.
So Tyler, that's to participate on one of our prescribed fires as a crew person, or to head out west with a state crew to help fight fires. What's involved for you with being a burn boss? Is that that was pretty simple, yeah?
No, so well, it starts like so everybody has to do. Oh, and I should mention, after you get certified, you have to do that pack test every year to maintain your certification, and then to move up in certification in wildland fire, basically you have to take more coursework, and you have to work yourself through these task books, they're called, which is basically like an apprenticeship where you do tasks on either prescribed fires or wildfires, and your supervisor fills them out, basically vouches for you. And so to get certified as a burn boss, you're in the operations section of the fire. So you start as a firefighter type 2, and there's a whole flow chart to this. It's probably pretty boring, but you go firefighter type 2 to firefighter type 1, and then after that, engine boss, firing, and crew, and then after that, incident commander type 4, and then burn boss. But there's a flow chart that you can look up on National Wildfire Coordination Group that shows how you move up. And anyway, that ends up all the way like a incident commander type 1 would be like managing Hurricane Katrina or some major incident like that, or a huge wildfire. So incident commanders at the type 1 and type 2 level come with an entire team. Steps below that.
How long, Tyler, did it take you to get through all that? That's not like you can do that in one summer.
No, it took 5 years for me to get that. So that was from 2011. I got certified in 2016, and I've bossed 69 burns here at the Pine Bush since then.
I'm thrilled that you know that number. When I was certified, I did like 82. When my back gave out and I couldn't do it anymore. But yeah, I'm thrilled you know that number. That's great. Do you have any more questions in the chat, Dylan? Or in the Q? I can't see the Q&A.
Scott has one in the Q&A, which pertains to fire a little bit. So he says, in the wrap barrens taking the trail clockwise, just after the bridge on the left, there's an area of very young white pines. Are these planted or natural? And are there plans to do anything with them?
Those are natural.
Yeah, those are natural, and we hope to kill those with fire. White pine, when they're small, is not tolerant to fire. Whereas pitch pine has dozens of adaptations to deal with and depend on fire. White pine, when they're small, do not. So if you're seeing white pine regen in the preserve, it's a good indication that we need to get in there and burn more frequently. White pine's great. I love it's a wonderful tree. In the pine barrens, though, it can be too much of a good thing.
That's what happens even with native plants in the pine bush in the absence of fire. They even native plants can become hyper abundant.
Even scrub oak. And that was the biggest awakening, the biggest paradigm shift for us was recognizing that what we used to think, what we initially thought was really high quality barrens, which was basically the stand structure like behind Steve, but it was a dog hair thicket of scrub oak with huckleberry and blueberry beneath it. We thought that was like high quality barrens. And now we know that we actually had too much of a good thing and we had too much scrub oak. And ideally, it's more like behind Dillon where you've got that grassy shrubland. So you have pitch pine and you have scrub oak, but the scrub oak itself, it's almost like a savanna within a savanna. The overstory canopy is open. The scrub oak canopy is very open. And then in all that space between the scrub oak, that's where the prairie grasses and wildflowers like the lupin behind Dillon, that's the space they would occupy. And honestly, it's that sweet spot, that condition, that grassy shrubland, that grassy shrubby savanna type of an environment simultaneously allows so many rare species to coexist in big numbers.
So Kat, kind of a good follow-up question. Kat says, does fire help eradicate any invasives? And I would say we don't know that it eradicates any for sure, but for sure it helps keep some things in check. And a good example of that is the, spotted knapweed, which is an invasive species. And that's one that not any one control on its own seems to be super effective in controlling it and keeping it in check. But so for example, there've been about, I think at this point, I think we're at 26 species of insects that have been introduced intentionally into the United States as biocontrols for spotted knapweed. But none of them on their own will actually eradicate the species. They just slow it down. And so actually the method that's suggested for kind of getting that in check is a combination of biocontrol and fire. Because the biocontrols weaken the plant, lower the seed set, and just basically kind of inhibit its ability to recover after a burn. So hopefully those two working in concert can actually start to knock it back a little bit. But here in the,
because it's so fragmented. Like when the preserve was whole, one big single contiguous block, it was really hard for a lot of these invasives to get into the middle of the geography, the middle of the barrens. But now with all the road edges and backyard edges and trail edges, there's a lot of edge. And that edge, one of the biggest impacts of all that edge effect is that it creates vectors or avenues for invasive species to get into places that historically they probably never would have been able to really get into successfully.
And unfortunately, a lot of the characters that make invasive species so invasive and so like able to take over also help them survive a fire. They have deep root systems. They are species that can reproduce quickly from seeds. They like disturbance. So those kinds of things that help plants recover from fire also can make them invasive, those same characters.
Tyler, you want to take a question from someone named Miss Craney?
We had a bunch of volunteers and partner agencies who helped us with the burn. So there was the National Park Service drove up from Pennsylvania to assist. They brought 7 people, UTV and a Type 6 engine. We also had 4 forest rangers there. We had other people from DEC and also from New York State Parks. And then we had some former employees, like Tori was there, and some other volunteers. So yeah, it was a mixture of Pine Bush personnel. Myself and Jesse were there on that burn, but then Todd and Dave are 2 fire techs for this year, and then the rest was made up of volunteers and partners. So out of the 27, only 4 of them actually worked at the Pine Bush.
You want to talk about how that's reciprocal, Tyler? How, we get, all of us in the Northeast only get maybe a handful of days to burn each year.
Yeah. Like what Neil was just saying, it's a tight-knit community in the Northeast, so we don't staff a full fire crew, so we rely on the help of other partners and volunteers, and then we assist them when they do burns in exchange for reciprocal support. So some of our key partners are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, especially the forest rangers, but also state parks. And then the National Park Service, we have a good relationship with them because of our proximity to Saratoga Battlefield and because their fire management officer used to work at the Pine Bush back in the day. So, and then there's a lot of bleed over. So some of the people that used to work at the Pine Bush now work for DEC and became forest rangers. So it's a close-knit community.
Awesome. Kat asked a funny question. Well, she put a pun on the end, which I would expect no less from Kat. She said, some new land has recently been added to the preserve. Will those spaces become priorities to burn, or will they be on the back burner?
That's funny.
Yeah, so those newer pieces are probably at the very beginning of the restoration phase of things, not the maintenance phase. So the restoration process typically involves, if there are invasive trees like black locust, we need to thin the forest, it would get mowed, we would deal with any other invasives that are in a site first with mechanical means and sometimes with chemical means to eradicate and try and reset the stage. And you can think about the restoration phase of fire management and our conservation work versus the maintenance phase, much like your own health, right? If you're really, really sick, you need to go to a doctor, you get a prescription, that prescription is from a trained professional for a specific thing, for a specific ailment. You've got directions on how to take it, and it's only for you. And it takes a lot, right, to get you back to health again. But then once you're healthy, you can pretty much stay healthy by doing all the things we know we're supposed to do, like, exercise, eat relatively well, yada, yada. Like staying healthy, if you do it, is relatively easy. But if you get really sick, it's a pretty heavy-handed approach to getting you well again. It's the same kind of thing with ecosystem health. When the ecosystem is unhealthy, like some of those new properties and their closed canopy forests of black locusts and other invasives, we need to go in and do a whole bunch of things first before we can put fire on the ground. And then eventually, once they're restored, they enter the maintenance phase of things where, for the most part, we're reintroducing fire every few years to keep it looking like it does behind us.
So, Kat, to echo what Neil said there, they're on the back burner, but not always. Because like there's a site on Curry Road where we actually thinned rather soon after acquiring, right, Neil, where the zebra property is.
Yeah.
And we're looking to burn that rather soon. So not always the case.
Yeah. But that did go through. So we actually, Fish and Wildlife Service gave DEC a grant to protect that property around 2004. So we've held that property that long before we then did the restoration work of thinning the forest, dealing with invasives, planting lupin, and now it's ready for fire. So that did go through that the gamut. But yes, Scott, there are several new properties in the western part of the preserve, getting out toward the Woodlawn area, the Schenectady County boundary. To answer that question, they're on various locations.
Yeah, there's a couple different parcels out in the Morris Road kind of area, or not Morris, Cordell Road.
All right.
Well, we are at 7:59.
Yeah.
Anything any of you want to add?
I guess I would just add, if anybody would like to follow up in like a more informal conversation, I'd be happy to talk to anybody at the Pine Bush or over the phone. So if you have any more questions about how the fires are implemented, or why we burn or anything like that, I'd be happy to talk to anybody.
And the Discovery Center is now open again 7 days a week. So we have a fully staffed education center. If anybody is interested and has time to come in and visit with the staff there, everybody has a pretty broad depth of knowledge about all things Pine Bush. So come on in, check out the exhibits and talk to the staff and learn even more. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I want to thank you all, you guys, Tyler, Steve, and Dylan, and Wendy for helping make this possible. And I look forward to hopefully doing more of these in the future. Have a great night, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.